So I think we might get started. We've got a die-hard audience of webinar fans who haven't suffered from webinar fatigue, like I think lots of people are. So thank you so much for joining us today, and really pleased to have a really exciting panel of interesting speakers to speak about data justice and COVID-19, and importantly to launch the very excellent new book, Data Justice and COVID-19 Global Perspectives, which is edited by the Data Justice crew, the Global Data Justice, excuse me, crew at the University of Tilburg. And we have Linnet Taylor here from the Global Data Justice team to represent her colleagues. I'm also very proud to introduce to you Karen Yeung from the University of Birmingham, and Vidushi Marda, who I didn't even check affiliations before we started. I'm so sorry how you would like to be introduced. Vidushi's a researcher at Article 19. Is there anything else I should add to that, Vidushi?
No,
I'm going to let you all give a little more of your affiliations. I'm clearly haven't professionalized as a webinar host, even despite all the webinars in the last few months. So I'm sorry that I didn't introduce you all better, and please feel free to tell us a little bit more about yourself when we invite your comments. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation today about technology, surveillance, data justice, and COVID-19. And we're going to have Linnet kick us off by introducing the book and talking us through some of the perspectives that are surfaced in the book and some of the themes that run throughout it.
Thanks very much, Carly, and thanks for having us on the call tonight. So the reason we put this book together was because our project is dedicated to trying to figure out a social justice-based framework for data governance on the global level, which is a big enough challenge without being unable to suddenly go and talk to people about this. So when COVID struck, and we all suddenly got locked down, we got together and thought, what could we possibly do that would be constructive under these circumstances? And we thought, hang on, we have this amazing global network and we could make it bigger. And we could ask people how the pandemic is changing the way people can be governed and controlled through data. And which was already kind of a focus of ours, but the pandemic really sharpened some of the things we were interested in. And so we've been looking at developing countries, we've been looking at ID technologies and biometrics in particular. We've been looking at financial technologies, we've been looking at refugees and humanitarian subjects. And so a lot of these things kind of came together within the problems that COVID seemed to be exacerbating. And we got together a network of people to write on, I think we have 35 countries covered in the book, which is obviously not representative of anything particular. It's an opportunity sample of the people who are able to participate at that particular moment in time. We put together the book in, I kid you not, 2.5 months, I think, start to finish. We have this phenomenal crew of scholars and activists and thinkers from all sorts of different disciplines and different areas of the world who all came together to produce essays that were roughly 1,000 words that just dealt with the idea of how is COVID changing data and governance and the conjunction of those two things. And so it covers absolutely everything from equality and inequality in COVID policy and how that gets exacerbated and amplified through tech, to legal shifts, to providing the legal basis for apps or not providing the legal basis for apps. And one of the things I grew particularly interested in was the different interactions that were occurring between the private sector and government around the world, around technology in light of the pandemic. Because it's not just about the apps, there was all this focus on the apps. And really the apps have been a bit of a red herring. We have 58 countries, according to your marvelous spreadsheet, Carly, at Ada Lovelace, which have an app. And most of them are struggling to get above 20% of uptake amongst the population right now. So it's a nice idea. If it works, it could support human contact tracing, but so far it's not really working. We don't have a proof of concept there as far as I can tell. However, business is booming. If you're in biometrics, if you're in tech development in general, everybody is attaching to the pandemic as a way to market tech they were already marketing, as a way to shift power around so that they can work in different spaces, they can capture new markets. We're seeing everything from, I mean, we're on a Zoom call right now, and probably a year ago it would have been a Skype call. WhatsApp has been adopted by the WHO as its global messaging platform. So that's Facebook, basically. We're seeing proctoring software put in place all around the world for anyone who has to try and take an exam at the college level right now, which has huge implications for the way that students engage with their educational institutions. We're seeing the biometrics industry undergo the kind of boom I don't think it's ever undergone. It's experiencing the kind of exponential growth that COVID has been experiencing. We're seeing a lot of market making around biometrics, ID systems, self-sovereign identity, around facial recognition, gait recognition, all sorts of things which are being marketed as ways to do remote identification in the time of the pandemic, but are actually just things that were already in place or already getting tested, and which are now being brought to market with great speed at great scale. Surveillance software obviously is booming. I mentioned proctoring software for exams, but also there are people marketing crazy systems that claim to tell you if people in the street have COVID by doing facial recognition on them. I mean, all kinds of opportunistic madness is happening all around the world. It's really interesting and quite disturbing to watch. And the book gives you a snapshot of the first 3 months of that. So it looks at the groundwork getting laid for all of these dynamics to come out. And the interesting thing for me now is reading it. It was written between mid-April and the very end of June. And reading it, I'm staggered by how accurate people's predictions were and by how interesting their areas of focus were compared to what has happened since. So the good news is it is worth buying this book, because even though it is a snapshot of the start of the pandemic, it actually provides useful pointers to how we should look at the outcome of the pandemic overall in maybe a year or even 5 years. It's also happily completely open access. You can buy the book, but there's also a link on the Meatspace website right at the bottom of the book page where you can download a PDF for free. And because that's how we work with our project, if stuff isn't globally accessible, then we're not doing our job. So thanks very much, and I'll pass back to you, Carly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linnet. I mean, congratulations on a really beautiful, actually, piece of scholarship, but also a kind of artifact of that time, as you point out. And I'm interested to know if you can call to mind any of the predictions that you were saying were made in the book that came true. Were they around the kind of success or failure of the apps that were still being trialed at that time, or are they more diverse
One thing
than
that made clear was that apps are a political exercise, and that they interact with other forms of trust and faith in government. And that if people lack trust, then that manifests very clearly around the app issue. I think you can also trace a pattern in the book of government being taken completely by surprise by demands for legitimacy in terms of the technologies being applied, and pushing as far as it can to put new systems in place, new forms of surveillance, new systems of governance through technology before there's a legal basis. I mean, it doesn't help that a lot of countries where we anticipate COVID to hit very hard, or anticipated COVID to hit very hard, still didn't have adequate data protection laws, or had very untested and unenforceable data protection laws. But it's not just about data protection. We see some countries starting to link up pandemic-related tracking systems with national ID systems, with police data systems. I know that Vidushi probably has something to say about that if you ask her. And we're seeing a lot of things linking up that were implied in the book, but not yet real.
You talk in the book about a epidemiological turn. We've all learned to say that term, I think, over the last 6 months. Epidemiological turn in digital surveillance. What do you mean by that term?
Well, I would say that 9/11 was a security-based turn in digital surveillance, and the pandemic is going to be seen retrospectively as an epidemiological turn, as in this is a new justification for things that were already happening, for piloting and testing and experimenting on new populations in particular, for extending the reach of particular technological actors around the world in ways that it wasn't previously present. So I think we've had a bunch of different turns in surveillance, but it's very clear that the justification of public health is a very powerful one for all kinds of new and existing surveillance technologies to be built out, and for their effects to become amplified, and for them to become detached from the rule of law and from legitimacy, I think. So that's been one interesting dynamic.
That's useful. provides a good point to turn to Vidushi's piece, which goes to this exact question. Before I do, I will do the things I omitted to do at the start, which is to tell you that we are recording this session, that there are closed captions available, and that of course you can put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, and please do so. So Vidushi, Linnet just talked there about how there's this, public health has become a really powerful justification for surveillance technologies. Your piece, you write really interestingly about the notion of health being posited as an alternative to privacy, that the two have been kind of posited as it being a trade-off in this crisis. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've observed that privacy versus the pandemic dynamic play out globally? And if possible, you don't write particularly about India in your piece, but if there are reflections that you want to give from the national experience there, it would be great to hear them too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and congrats again to Linnet for putting together this amazing, beautiful book. I've made sure to say it's a beautiful book because it's really quite a lovely piece of work. It's interesting that Linnet said it's a snapshot in time, because I reread my own piece this morning and I was taken back to, mid-April to mid-May, when we were kind of like getting used to the idea of, being in lockdown, getting used to the idea of having N95 masks, or, knowing what an N95 mask even was, and all of those different things. And one of the first things that tend to happen, I think, when emergency strikes is that there is a need to do something. And we've seen that before, like Linnet said, during 9/11, there was a need to do something in terms of security. And a similar thing happened with respect to health around the world, and also in India where I lived, where it was, contact tracing was being kind of like posited as this, magic app that will make sure that you don't ever come in contact with someone who has been, who is tested positive, or who has been in contact with someone who has tested positive. And the ways in which the contact tracing apps came into existence, it really reminded me of 2009 in India, when we saw the Aadhaar system come into existence, because it was done in a hurry. It was done under a very specific justification, right? So a justification that had to do with health. That is something that, intuitively appeals to people. It was done without any consultation or transparency processes. It was done in the absence of laws. And so the chapter is really like a stream of consciousness of like a linear way in which I thought about the issue. Because my first instinct was to say, well, this doesn't fully add up and it's oversimplifying a problem, because we do have, legal standards on how you can legally restrict fundamental rights. And, in fact, most of those restrictions are put in place so that governments don't overreach in times of crisis. But somehow those very restrictions are diluted in the time of crisis, which ironically they're or. And so the first instinct was that. But then the second one was to say, hold on, even if we did have a transparent process, even if we did have data protection laws, it doesn't change the fact that the actors who are involved in this conversation have different incentives from what the public would necessarily want. I looked up very quickly as you were talking, Carly, to see what the, how people have benefited from the pandemic. It feels almost ridiculous to say, but I think the number is somewhere around $637 billion that billionaires have racked up during this period. And, there are many reasons for that. Of course, there are, incentives such as, have an app in the market and let it work and things like that. But in general, I think there's this tendency to say that we have an app and it'll work and it'll do ABC things to make your life better in this particular moment of crisis. Or there's a tendency to say we can make this app because we have data and we have machine learning and we have every shiny technology that you can possibly think of. I think the market incentives that Linnet mentioned in the beginning are kind of lost because often technologies exist in society not because they work, but because the people who are building them say they work, or the people who are using them want them to work. We've seen that with facial recognition, where we start off with these lofty promises, but then as you as you use them and as evidence mounts against how they actually work in the real world, we don't actually see their potential being realized. And the next layer of complication was that not only were the private actors, you know, who are benefiting from this and who have the incentive to roll out apps, you know, being allowed to do so in the absence of legal protections, there is no legal safeguards that can be meaningfully applied against private actors, because fundamental rights, by and large, have a vertical relationship between individuals and state, and not neatly against private actors. And the last point that I will make really quickly is that even so in my stream of consciousness, so I said, okay, fine, we know the actors are problematic, but say we had more transparency in the process of building these technical solutions. The thing that came to mind after that was that even if we do have technical solutions, they are definitely not enough, and they're definitely not at the forefront of what we need in this particular moment. What we needed was funding for healthcare. What we needed were PPE kits. What we needed were, you know, structures of governance and trust building exercises from governments, which we didn't have. And so in the chapter I write, it's kind of like a distraction. This whole dichotomy between privacy and health starts off by saying it's an emergency response, but when you really unpack it and peel off all the layers, it's both an oversimplification, but also, I think, more dangerously a distraction.
It's interesting. We ran some public deliberation work during the crisis, and we engaged with participants on this question of kind of privacy versus the pandemic, the trade-off, and we found that most people, it was less about I think you're getting to this, that it wasn't that they weren't prepared to accept some intrusions into their privacy in order to aid in the pandemic response, but rather they wanted the rationale for why those were necessary at all, why the system required them in order to work, and then why they should trust the system. So it wasn't like a trade-off of either I'm happy to give over everything, or I'm and because I want my health, or I'm more interested in my privacy, but actually the level of understanding, public understanding, has advanced such that they realize that that trade-off isn't actually necessary, that you can have both, and that the trade-off itself was a distraction. I'm interested in what you write about privatization in the piece. So you wrote what I thought was a very striking statement, which is the systemic and systematic privatization of governance perpetuates the dilution of rights because it involves a grave misalignment of incentives. And you started speaking a bit there about the incentives that the big tech had to essentially aid the pandemic response. But another way of looking at what ended up happening with contact tracing in particular is that Google and Apple developed the system, which was a very privacy protecting system, and in fact aligned with the kind of interests of the populations, but they equally could have chosen a different approach. And I think I'm interested in your thoughts about what that tells us about the power of those companies in the ecosystem, you know, in the digital surveillance ecosystem, I suppose. And why do you think they made that choice in this instance?
Yeah, it kind of, I keep going back to snapshots 10 or 15 years ago that this reminds me of, but when Twitter was used for the Arab Spring, for instance, we talked about how it was an amazing platform to bring together people in ways that they could never be brought to before. And in 2020, we're talking about disinformation and elections and things like that. So I think the first issue that I have, that sounds unnecessarily critical, but I think the first discomfort that I have is that we're giving away so much power to an already powerful stakeholder group that we kind of lose that negotiating power that should exist in economies and in societies and in countries. You know, I can give you an example from India, where we have this app called Arogya Setu, which was made by a coalition of volunteers called iSpirit. They're closely related with India's biometric ID system, Aadhaar. And recently, one of the volunteers said, you know, we're going to maybe use this as a building block for the national health stack. But at the same time, we're not going to use Arogya Setu beyond the COVID pandemic. So what that tells me is that it's also not about the form that we see. It's not about the app on your phone. It's about what's going on behind the app, right? So we're giving away a lot of information. We're giving away a lot of sensitive information under the guise of aligned incentives and data protection and emergency responses and the fact that reasonable restrictions should exist. But the power to make sure that kind of transfer doesn't happen, especially in the absence of any legal basis, is, I think, particularly dangerous. So to me, it's like lightning in a bottle. Yes, two of the biggest companies in the world decided to, promote a privacy-preserving technology, but can we really bank on it? Palantir's Gotham, and there's one more whose name I'm forgetting, their suite of products that have been extremely problematic in many different jurisdictions are also being used in the pandemic response, right? So I think while it is heartening that we have good examples, I think that those examples are still very much the exception and not the norm, not the rule.
Yeah. Thanks, Vidushi. I'm going to turn to Karen now. Karen's piece, really interesting, focuses on governance and accountability. And Karen, I'd like you just to kind of recap some of the thoughts that you shared there. I think you also go to this question that's been brought up by both Linnet and Vidushi of privatization in the private sector. And so I'm interested in your thoughts also on how we think about that in the context of governance.
Sure. Thanks, Carly. And firstly, congratulations, Linnet, on a wonderful book and monumental coordination effort. It made me exhausted just imagining how much coordination that involved. I salute you. I totally salute you. Well done. And as you've all mentioned, really fantastic to have that snapshot of a point in time. And I also remember at the time of writing it, there was a sense in which we were also thrown by this, that none of us had any experience of anything like this. And so trying to get a grip and an analytical framework for really making sense of it was quite challenging. And so I found it really interesting to read all of the country contributions and to see the variation as well as the common themes that were emerging across the world. And there was a clear trend, as Vidushi mentioned, towards reaching for some kind of digital magic. That if we do something with this digital magic that we have, we will stem the tide of the spread of the virus. And as time has gone on, as you've already mentioned, the effectiveness of this digital magic has been seriously placed into question. And one of the things I think that struck me when I was thinking about writing for the collection was how, even though there was so much emphasis on these digital solutions, in fact, the most significant interventions that governments adopted in order to stem the flow and to contain the virus were very conventional social restrictions. Stay home, don't go out, minimize your social contact. And there was this really interesting paradox for me, because there was always focus on digital technologies, which are primarily about the communication of information and data and the powerful things we might be able to do with that. But at the end of the day, the virus works on our bodies. And they also demonstrated how as important as digital communication technologies have been in order for us to keep contact and to keep working for those of us who've been able to, they were no substitute for actually the presence of other bodies, the people that we loved. And this was really visible in the impact of the lockdown on people who died, basically, and people who died without their loved ones by their side because they were trying to respect the lockdown request, if you like. Because, again, another thing that was now starting to emerge is that many of these lockdown orders were not actually legal. Yeah, they were promulgated in the form of statements by the Prime Minister and those in power saying, please do this and do that. And there was a real lack of clarity, actually, about what the legal restrictions were, in fact. And so looking at, for example, the report by the Joint Committee on Human Rights from the UK Parliament, in fact, the relevant laws that impose those very strict lockdown orders, or apparently strict lockdown orders in the UK at the start, in fact, made an exception for reasonable excuse But that wasn't what we were told. We were told simply to stay home, and major sacrifices were made by people who did not offer the kind of assistance and care that they wanted to offer because of their commitment to trying to do the right thing. And I suppose that took me to the question of social cooperation and trust and solidarity, that actually at the end of the day, this is a massive collective action problem where you need the whole of society to buy into the containment measures and the interventions that are being brought into place in order to stem the tide of the virus. And that is a very big ask. And to do that, you really need the voluntary coordination of citizens. So no matter how instantaneous digital communication can be, ultimately, if these things are going to mobilize an entire population to cooperate, it's absolutely vital that you have that kind of trust. And in particular, because these decisions about containment and what kind of interventions are justified require these really tough trade-offs, it's so important in governing legitimately and effectively that those trade-offs would be articulated and justified, and in particular, the exercise of extraordinary powers is underpinned by safeguards. And that, I think, I'm very concerned about the lack of legal basis increasingly that we see in many of the interventions that have taken place. And even today, for example, stringent lockdown requirements, apparently, I haven't looked at what the regulations actually say, that in the UK, people cannot go and pay visits to people in care homes. And a law firm has mounted an action and said, we think this is a violation of basic human rights. And the response from the relevant government department has been, sorry, we're too busy to deal with that right now. In other words, the rule of law is a sideshow as far as those in power are concerned, because we're just too busy attending to the real crisis. And so foundational safeguards upon which we assume to always be in place in constitutional democracies, even like Britain's, which I find kind of astonishing, has simply been swept aside in the interests of effective government. And this is equally true in relation to the extraordinary extent to which provision of public services has been privatised or contracted out to private sector providers without the standard kinds of scrutiny and safeguards and accountability that we would typically expect. And so we are left without justification, without explanation, and this in turn undermines public trust further. So unless those basic good governance principles are adhered to, I think that the probability of actually bringing the public along with the kinds of interventions that are needed are not very optimistic. And so one of the things that has happened, I think, as time has gone on, is we're moving from a state of exception to a this is the new normal, where we're starting to, I think, expect that we would have better justifications for the kinds of measures that are implemented, but they're not forthcoming, and I find this really troubling. So I'll stop there and I'll let you go on.
And Karen, I'm interested in the argument around you make in the paper around solidarity applying to compliance with the lockdown measures. You know, that was really seen as a form of social solidarity. There are those that have said that solidarity in the digital realm requires kind of submission to these surveillance mechanisms, and do you see there being like a qualitative difference between compliance with lockdown in a physical sense on the one hand and compliance with digital surveillance? Should we think about those two things in different ways, and if so, what's the difference, I suppose?
Yeah, so that's what I go on to do that in the paper, is to try and contrast kind of conventional social interventions with the potential power of digital interventions. So one of the things that has become possible simply because of the widespread take-up of smart devices is the possibility of unilateral imposition of digital surveillance, should that be technologically possible. So if there was sufficient cooperation from those who actually have access to the software that enables smart devices, it would be technologically possible then to simply unilaterally impose those kinds of surveillance mechanisms without the cooperation of individuals. So there's quite a critical juncture between to what extent are any kind of digital solutions voluntary, or to what extent are they simply imposed and insisted on. And again, reading through the country by country accounts, you can see quite a range of different responses, which I thought was really striking in terms of the political culture. But of course, then you're caught in a bind if you're in a so-called liberal state where there's a commitment to, oh, these are completely voluntary, then there is a potential trade-off between, if you really want to collect a comprehensive survey of data, then you really do want widespread take-up. Otherwise, you're only going to get a partial picture. So there is a little bit of a bind there in terms of how much you want to collect all the data to give you a synoptic oversight of what's going on. But there is, of course, a preliminary question about, well, would you actually acquire that kind of synoptic viewpoint at all? And even then, it's quite questionable whether or not you could. So the question of effectiveness, I think, is often being sidelined in these discussions, because it's being presented as a quick fix and a solution. One of my least favourite words in the world is solution to a problem, without actually asking, but does it work? Does it actually work? What is it supposed to do? And can you establish that, in fact, it will do that? And that's really been missing in this whole piece as far as my observations are concerned.
Yeah, I think, there's some interesting examples in the book about countries that, to your point about unilateral imposition that digital surveillance allows. I think that's a really interesting definitional point. And there's some good examples in the book about these digital quarantines. I think it was Hungary. I can't remember exactly which countries are using, not for contact tracing, but for like unilaterally, in effect, restraining people in their houses, which is a kind of interesting contrast to the voluntary and widespread compliance with voluntary decisions to stay home. One more question for you, Karen, on your governance points. I'm just interested in your thoughts from a legal perspective. Obviously, like lots of legal traditions provide for exceptional measures in times of crisis or times of emergency. And I think there was an argument that we were in that for a period of time. And as we move to an understanding that COVID is going to be a lengthy period of our lives, 2-3 years potentially, should we be thinking about this as an exceptional period of time during which we can have exceptional laws and provisions and then revert back to the normal? Or is it the case now that things that are happening are happening in the new normal? Everybody hates that phrase already now, but is there any legal argument for how we're in an emergency, or are we actually just in reality, real life now?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm not quite sure what normal is anymore, but I suppose you can say pre-COVID, the situation is definitely not pre-COVID. The question is, what does mid-COVID look like? And what should legal safeguards be mid-COVID? And one of the things that I sense is we do have more evidence now about the risks and complications and the groups that are most at risk and most vulnerable, and those who are much less vulnerable. So thank goodness children are much less at risk than older age groups, for example, and we know much more about things to do to prevent and to try and safeguard against transmission. So I think that certainly changes the balance of potential interventions and the degree to which we can justify intrusiveness. The more data and the more knowledge that we have, then it becomes less possible to say, there's too much uncertainty, so you need to confer on the state as much power as possible. Otherwise, we won't be able to respond effectively and decisively in a crisis. So I think it's fair to say that, yes, we're not in a pre-COVID position, but I think it's also fair to say that the situation is not extreme and extremely uncertain in the same way that it was when the pandemic first broke. And so we are now able to make more sober assessments at the kinds of implications of a range of interventions, and to try and acknowledge the difficult nature of those trade-offs and do our best to justify why particular trade-offs should be considered acceptable or not. And that's the piece that I think we really need to work towards in our governing institutions, and which I don't see yet at the moment.
So if we move into a conversation about what was when you were writing these pieces to what is now and what should be going forward, I think there's a few questions about what is who is doing this well from a digital perspective. Is there something we can learn from countries around the world which are striking the right balance? Are we seeing any positive trends around digital technologies? And are there countries, for example, South Korea or Taiwan, where we understand there's been a relatively successful response to the pandemic that also integrates technology that we can learn something from? Linnet, is there anything in the book that we could take from the essays on those countries that we might want to share with others?
Yes, I mean, I wish we had Taiwan in there as well, but I see a couple of things around the Southeast Asia responses where there's a lot less shock and a lot less exceptionalism about the notion of the pandemic, as far as I can tell, where those countries have been prepping for this for a long time now, sort of maybe 15 to 20 years. There's been an awareness that this was where it would begin and that people would be very much at risk in those countries. And we see different kinds of preoccupation. We see preoccupations with, does the tech work well? Right? We see preoccupations with, is it legitimate within the bounds that I consider appropriate for a pandemic? Because people have somehow sort of figured out what they think is appropriate during COVID, as Karen said, behavior on the part of a government. And they're comparing what's going on with that rather than the extremes of, oh, help, everyone's dying versus there's nothing going on at all, which is what we're sort of doing in the higher income countries and in the North in particular, where we're still so in shock that we've been touched by this problem, because we aren't usually touched by problems like this, that we have either this rampant libertarian response going on where no one's allowed to impact anyone's civil and political rights in any way for the common good, or where we're so in danger we have to do everything we possibly can and screw civil rights and privacy and fundamental rights. And I think there's a bit of a more measured response going on in the Southeast Asian countries that practiced, is my point.
And they practice because they've had previous experiences with pandemics and had started to put some of these these kind of processes in play.
It's also interesting that lots of international actors have been at work there for quite a while on communication strategies, have been collaborating with government on preparation. I mean, there are countries that have problems with their democracies, but they don't have problems with their pandemic response, which is interesting. So somehow these two things were able to proceed on parallel tracks rather than getting overly mixed up with each other. I'm not sure you'd say that if you were a citizen of Hong Kong right now, for instance, but in general, there is less angst related to tech in light of the pandemic than there is related to other types of civil rights issues, I think, going on. And that's an interesting phenomenon for me to watch from here.
I think you acknowledge in the book that the book predates or doesn't engage with the Black Lives Matter movement re-emerging this year. But I'm interested in any thoughts the panel has on how the two things interrelate, COVID, digital surveillance, and Black Lives Matter. And we have a question in the Q&A from Shauna in Australia saying, how will digital surveillance, especially in the current climate, have an impact on racial discrimination? I wondered if anyone wanted to pick up that question. I'll also give you another one, which is on biometrics specifically. How will biometric social protection systems change in response to COVID-19? Perhaps I'll go to Vidushi on that, because India has arguably the largest biometric social protection system. Are there things that you're seeing from India on how COVID's impacting Aadhaar and other infrastructure? And is there, to what extent do you see it interacting with the Black Lives Matter movement or movements around racial justice more broadly?
I'll take your second question first, Kali. I think the fact that COVID impacts people of color and historically disadvantaged communities much more than it impacts others, I think is something we need to preface across the board. So I think by definition and by its very nature, that is the case. I think what the Black Lives Matter protests crystallized, at least to my mind, is the fact that institutions play a really important role, and that role of the institutions has never been more obvious in a social media, pop culture kind of way than it is now. So I think the notion of trust that we've touched upon in various interventions today kind of goes to the heart of the matter, because often when we think of tech, and again, I go back a few years before, much of the critique had really emerged in context of emerging technology specifically, it was seen as, something that can solve. Now I think there's a shift to seeing it as something that can exacerbate problems, or something that can make new problems by ways in which it classifies and tracks people. So I think that a similar parallel can and should, and perhaps is already being drawn with COVID-19 responses, just because of the ways in which particularly contact tracing apps have evolved, because this evolution of voluntary but mandatory if you want to have a comfortable life, to absolutely mandatory if you want to lead any semblance of a normal life. Usually, especially in context of Aadhaar, we saw over maybe 5 years. With COVID-19 responses, what we've seen is that happened in maybe 4 weeks. And so the acceleration at which individuals experience the limitations and the serious shortcomings of institutional frameworks which are supposed to serve and work with them is perhaps really, really magnified in a sense. I don't know if that's the perfect word to use, but I'll go with that for now. And the second question about...
Well, it was in fact to that question there, I think the point you just made around how COVID, or how biometric social protection systems will change in response to COVID. I mean, sorry, I don't want to preempt your decision. I just want to remark that was a really interesting observation you just made there about the timeline that Aadhaar followed to become voluntary to effectively mandatory, and then that being mirrored with contact tracing. But can you see any impacts on Aadhaar or from COVID-19, or I think you spoke a little about the integration potentially between the contact tracing system. Is that the kind of remit? Is that the extent of which you're seeing the Aadhaar changes the system as a result of COVID?
I don't know if I've thought about the two of them as something that is integrated. I see the two of them mirroring similar trajectories and mirroring similar rationales, even mirroring similar issues that will potentially arise from them. Because, when we heard about Arogya Setu, which is the contact tracing app in India, being potentially used to seed or be the building block, quote unquote, of the national health stack. What I'm reminded by, or rather reminded of, is how we think about the use and reason for why technologies come into existence. Right? So, for instance, Aadhaar came into existence to authenticate public service delivery. And then it has become this thing that makes sure that, you have to have it to, file your taxes and do all kinds of things. Similarly, what we're seeing now with Arogya Setu and, how the national health stack is developing is also, it's hurried. The consultation period for it was like 1 or 2 weeks, I think, initially. It will evolve by definition. It will evolve to something that is integrated with health data of individuals, and where health data sits right now happens to be in this app. So I don't see them as really playing off of one another. I think of them as like kind of, walking a similar path, just a couple of years separated.
It's really interesting. Karen, I wanted to ask you a bit more on you talked about the kind of excessive privatization or involvement of the private sector in the response to COVID. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on what the right balance should be. And I think that this is a broader question on tech development, AI, data, and government more generally, even outside of the pandemic. It can't be the position that we expect all tech development to happen within government or within public sector. And in fact, maybe that's something we actively don't want, because they probably don't do it as well in some instances, or discuss, I suppose. But do you have maybe either what is the right balance, or what is the right process to ensure we get to the right balance?
Okay, so I wish I had simple answers to those questions, but I don't. And this has been a growing problem in terms of digital tech for a little while. Okay, and the reality is that the real cutting edge expertise in AI, for example, is in the private sector. And they have the money, the global reach, and the power to recruit the brightest minds. So they are doing the cutting edge development, and partly because of the austerity agenda that has prevailed for at least the last decade, we see national governments lacking any similar kinds of expertise. So it's sort of inevitable in a sense that they will look to the experts in the private sector to provide the kinds of skills and know-how and capacity that's not currently available in the public domain. So the question is then, is that a problem? And it's I suppose, coming back to your observation about, you know, the alignment of the government interested in managing COVID and Google and Apple. In some ways, you can see this as, well, it's at its core, it's a problem of power. And so this is why we have this really troubling situation where we are now in a situation where the power in the tech industry clearly rests in the private domain. And we have yet to bring that power under effective democratic control, because the narrative is it's really up to the market, and so you buy into it if you want, but the truth is there really isn't an opportunity to opt out in contemporary life. So if it is the case that the state really does need to buy in that kind of expertise, then you have in many ways a classic principal agent problem. If the state and society is the principal and the private sector is the agent, and there is a so-called agency cost because of the misalignment, then economics tells us that what you need then is stringent oversight. You need contractual provisions to ensure the best you can that there is an alignment between the private sector property agent and the principal. And yet what we have seen is all of those kinds of safeguards thrown out the window, that we don't see effective safeguards built into the contracts by which services have been provided. Instead, we see massive discretion that is built into these contracts. We see no transparency, very little justifications for why particular decisions are taken, or why particular access is granted to private sector without justification, without a proportionately demonstrated response. And so here again, I think there is a really urgent need. We shouldn't use it. I can see that it's important to try and make the most of that expertise, but we really have to make sure that we have proper oversight and legitimate the way in which that expertise is brought in, and ensure that we have at least safeguards that guard against excessive discretionary power being placed outside the remit of the democratic body. And that's the thing that really worries me.
Thanks, Karen. That was a really comprehensive way of thinking about it. I'm gonna move to wrap us up, but in doing so, I want to go through each of the panelists, and I want to ask you. I want to end on a happy note. So I want to ask you, what should we be hopeful about? What have you seen in the last 6 months in the context of digital governance, surveillance, tech, that makes you feel positive, whether it's a kind of seeing technology be used in a privacy preserving way, or seeing a government that was appropriately restrained, or seeing a movement or awareness? What is it that makes you feel good coming out of, well, not coming out of COVID, I suppose moving into mid-COVID, as Karen called it, and which I'm definitely going to appropriate that term going forward. Linnet, I'll start with you.
Thanks. The thing that keeps me going is the fact that there are lots of countries which were expected to suffer very badly in the pandemic, and I've already spoken about these countries, but which had really practiced and which had managed over the years to separate out the pandemic from the politics. And watching what happened next was an education. And I'm so happy that smaller, I mean, like Laos, for instance, I don't think has had any deaths. I mean, I'm happy. This is really nice. Cambodia also. I could be wrong, they could have now, but you know, a couple of months ago, there was a radically different trajectory in countries which managed to keep their heads, to keep their sanity, and to treat tech as an instrument rather than as a solution. And I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, especially in the North. And it's a pleasure to watch the South teaching the North something in such a in-your-face way. It was really time for us to learn this lesson, and it's nice to see it happening.
Nice, thank you. Vidushi.
I have some version of that, unfortunately, which is, I think it's heartening when tech isn't leading the response. I think within, you know, the technology community, we have this kind of realization over the last couple of years that, you know, technologists can't be the only people in the room. Like, you need to listen to social scientists and lawyers and philosophers and the like. And I think a similar thing is happening with respect to emergency pandemic response, where tech shouldn't and can't lead because the expertise doesn't lie there. I think for me, that is perhaps the most important, because when we make that shift, we then kind of like lay bare the issues around, you know, who needs to have the power, who takes the call, who gets the funding, you know, what do we prioritize? And I think that is kind of what has cost us a lot in the first phase of beginning COVID. It feels depressing to say that after 6 months, but yeah, I think that would be my takeaway. But for tech to actually take the back seat and not pretend like it will ever be the solution, quote unquote.
Yeah, agreed. Karen.
I really like Linnet's response. I'm going to appropriate that. I think that has been really heartening, actually, to see small countries who we don't typically consider advanced really managing well. I think that's been so impressive. But actually, not on the tech side so much, but in terms of the Republic of Science, I have been really impressed with our biomedical scientists and how they have been making enormous responsible progress towards finding a vaccine, and the contrast between the lessons that have been learned in administering clinical interventions and the care that is needed in producing a vaccine. And, you know, for example, the Oxford vaccine has been going through human trials, and they've paused it when side effects have been found in volunteers, and the way in which that is governed in a much more responsible manner because of a real awareness of the unintended side effects. And this is really an enormous contrast to the kind of mentality that prevailed in, and I think still prevails, in relation to digital tech. And that comes out really nicely in Rob Kitchener's contribution, because there was definitely a sense at the start of the pandemic, if you could come up with the digital solution, let's just do it. That there was no downside whatsoever, you know, and in fact, you know, a really eminent machine learning expert said to me, but, you know, why don't we just throw the digital kitchen sink at it? And the answer is, because it has costs. And those costs are not just economic. And I think there is a real, and we still haven't really grasped that as a society, that because the whole narrative is about how it's seamless and convenient and free, that there are no costs, there are no downsides, and there are no side effects. And there really are. And I think that one of the lessons that we have learned is, well, I hope that we learned, is that we really do need to attend to these secondary effects that are not primarily front and center of those who are trying to formulate the response, but to think about the broader effects and to take care to factor them into the decision making that's taken, which I absolutely agree is complex and difficult, and I don't envy them at all. But I really think we have a responsibility to attend to those secondary effects before we bulldoze in with a solution.
I think you took my request for a positive answer and gave a slightly negative one at the end, but I'll accept it anyway.
Can't help it.
So, I'll give you my own anecdote, my own answer to the question, which is much less complex, which is I've had some great video consultations with doctors over the lockdown period with my toddler, and I've been amazed at how the digitization of the health service at a kind of dumb tech level. You know, so much of the conversation's been about smart, advanced digital tech, AI solving all the problems, but just getting video consultations to work has been, for me, has given me an immense like enjoyment and personal benefit. And so it's been nice to see some investment in non-surveillance related technological advancements at the same time as well. Thank you so much, Karen, Linnet and Vidushi, for your time, and thank you again for the contribution of this beautiful book. And I really do urge people to download it for free or to buy it. It's also a lovely thing to have on your shelf. Thank you all for joining us, and you can also follow our work at Ada Lovelace Inst on Twitter, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Carl.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.